morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. I'm glad you're here, and Tuesday's always a fun day in the program. We get a chance to catch up with Jeff Sentell a little later on. A lot of recruiting stuff to get into with him. Some of these 2020 names starting to make a little bit of movement, make a little bit of noise. Jeff's got some really good stuff coming up on all of that. He's going to be writing that at DawgNation.com. We'll get a bit of a preview from him on that today here on DawgNation Daily. I also believe that ESPN's getting something wrong about Georgia, and we'll start the program with that right now as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We know the narrative with Georgia by now. A lot of Georgia fans are kind of tired of it, but it is what it is. Georgia has been close. Oh, so close the last couple of years of breaking through that big barrier, not just getting past Alabama, but actually winning the national championship. Georgia has been really the best of the teams not to do that, right? And that's a narrative that at this point in time Georgia fans have grown a little weary of, but as I said before, it just sort of is what it is. And then in the lead up and the build up to the 2019 season, there's going to be a lot of diagnosing going on of why was it that Georgia almost broke through in 2017 and won the national championship, but did not? And why was it that Georgia almost got past Alabama in December of 2018 in the SEC championship? Who knows what would have happened in the college football playoff beyond that? But once again, the place that had been the stopping point for Georgia a year ago became the stopping point again for 2018, and the media is going to try to put its detective hat on to figure out what that's all about and why that's going on. And I do believe, and maybe some of you will feel differently about this when I lay all of it out, but I do believe that the media, for the most part, gets this wrong, especially when it comes to the big flagship of media, which is ESPN. And their early look at what Georgia's going to be like this spring and ultimately what it's going to be like on the field once the 2019 season begins. I feel like that ESPN is almost guilty, a little bit of danger of going down the wrong road in describing why Georgia has come up just short in 2017 and 2018. Let me give you an example of what has been said, then we'll kind of figure out what the real truth actually is. Now, this is not something I'm necessarily mad about. I don't think it's something to be all that critical of. I just think it's an interesting conversation starter for those of us who care about Georgia football. ESPN.com has its pre-spring preview up for the Georgia Bulldogs. Alex Scarborough is the writer, and one of the sentences that caught my attention was this one from Scarborough, who says about Georgia, there might be a, listen to this phrase, mental hurdle left for this program to clear, but there's nothing in the way of a talent gap. Despite significant changes to the roster and the coaching staff, the Bulldogs are expected to be right back in title contention next season. Well, we would all agree with that last sentiment. Certainly, Georgia is right in the thick of the national championship conversation for 2019. But it's the beginning parts of what Scarborough writes that I think there's some interest in. He says, no problem with the talent, but there might be a bit of a mental hurdle. And if people want to kind of prescribe Georgia as having had a mental hurdle against Alabama the last couple of seasons, I just think that's getting it wrong. And ultimately, this is going to end up being, I think, good news for Georgia. But the idea that Georgia is somehow dealing with the mental, the yips, the, believing in itself, can't quite get over that final hurdle. Alabama's in Georgia's head, which is a phrase that you hear thrown around a lot. I just don't necessarily think that's true. Now, to be clear, there is a mental aspect of playing a game like Alabama, and Kirby Smart's acknowledged that before. In fact, let me go back in time before the national championship game at the end of the 2017 season in January of 2018. I mean, the one thing that Kirby acknowledged going into that game was there is at least some mental aspect of this, of how you want to feel when it's all said and done. You want to make sure that you've done everything you can in terms of your focus and preparation. He wouldn't deny that, nor would I. In fact, here's Kirby Smart talking about that very point.
What keeps you up a little extra long at night, knowing that opportunity is right in front of you and how precious it is?
Well, I think just that, you don't know, you don't appreciate, especially for a guy that was at Alabama so long. Sometimes you can lose the appreciation for what it takes, and you can't take it for granted. You don't know when your next opportunity is coming, when the right mixture happens. It takes a lot of things to fall in place. Certainly we want to build for the long haul and build for that success, but we want to have no regrets about this game.
Now, it's easy to look at what happened to Georgia in that game and at the end of the 2017 season when Tua Tagovailoa threw the touchdown pass to Devontae Smith in overtime and say, oh, Georgia had the lead, let it slip away. That's a game in which you have some regrets. And then to have something similar happen in the 2018 game back in December when Tua Tagovailoa leaves the game because of an injury, Jalen Hurts comes in. Now it's he who orchestrates the comeback. I think it's easy to look at that game and say, oh, if you're Georgia, you must have some regrets. And yeah, I guess in terms of the fact that a lead slipped away, then that kind of fits into that narrative. But it's not like Georgia's up by 50 points in either one of these games. It's only a couple touchdowns. Teams come back from a couple touchdown deficits all the time. It just seems more significant when it happens to Georgia versus Alabama in a national championship game or an SEC championship game. I'm not making light of what occurred. I think the thing that you want to point to, though, if you're Georgia, is building up to a point in which you don't have to be quite so perfect to beat Alabama. If you look at the way that Georgia's played in the last two first halves against Alabama, you would suggest, well, the Dogs have played pretty close to perfect. But you want to get to a point where I think the talent level grows to the point where the margin of error is not quite so slim playing in a game like this. And I guess the ultimate takeaway when you look at where Georgia's been in comparison to Alabama is that the message that Kirby gave after the 2017 game is the same message that you give after the 2018 game. It doesn't ring quite as true when the same thing happens 2 years in a row, but the overall truth of the message isn't lessened at all. Kirby said before that there's a permanence to what Georgia's building when it comes to the comparison between Alabama, and that still echoes, I think, even today. In fact, here is Kirby after that national championship game from 2017.
You know, I can't say enough about the remarkable senior class. These two young men sitting next to me, they meant more to Georgia than yards. A lot of heart and soul, a lot of fire. Sonny Michel came over and talked to the group several times during the game, inspired those guys. But in overtime, we didn't finish when we had to, and Alabama did. And to give them credit, but I think everybody can see that Georgia's going to be a force to be reckoned with. I'm very proud of this team and this university, and we're not going anywhere.
We're not going anywhere. That's what Kirby Smart said after the 2017 game, a force to be reckoned with. He believed they were building, and as I said on a previous podcast a couple of months ago, it doesn't sound quite as good to say after another loss to Alabama, from Kirby Smart's perspective, we're still not going anywhere, but I don't believe the overall message is any less true. I still don't believe that Georgia's going anywhere, nor should I think Georgia fans believe that, nor do I think that Georgia coaches or players feel any differently. They still feel like they are building something along the way that's going to get past the Alabama Crimson Tide, and it's not about some mental barrier to being able to do it. So you may ask then, well, what does it eventually become about? What is the story of what Georgia's going to need to do to finally overtake Alabama? It's actually the exact opposite of the way that Alex Scarborough describes it in my mind. Scarborough says there might be a mental hurdle, but there's nothing in the way of a talent gap. I think if you ask Kirby Smart in his most honest moment to describe what he thinks is happening between Georgia and Alabama, ever so slowly with each recruiting class, Georgia is adding the kind of talent that ultimately will close the talent gap. That as much 4- and 5-star talent as Georgia's collected over the course of the last, 4 recruiting cycles, heading to Kirby's 5th recruiting cycle in 2020, Alabama has recruited at such a level for such a long time that equaling Alabama from a talent standpoint is still a really difficult thing to do. In fact, even in 2019, Georgia's going to be really, really close to being as talented as Alabama, but from an overall composite standpoint, the Crimson Tide are probably going to have still a handful more blue-chip former 4- and 5-star prospects on the roster, and that's the issue that Georgia continues to combat when it takes on Alabama head-to-head. In fact, if you want to go back to the past one more time with Kirby Smart, he's acknowledged that. Getting ready for games against Alabama, looking at old film of Alabama, even for a guy like Kirby Smart, who lived through these teams as its own defensive coordinator, he still marvels at just how much talent was in place there in Tuscaloosa. For some perspective, here's more from Kirby.
I watched a clip of today, LSU versus Alabama. We were doing a drill called Get the Ball Back, and we showed our team trying to stop them. There were 8 first-rounders lined up on the defense. Is that where we want to be? Are we there? No. But obviously we want to get there.
So Kirby Smart back in 2017 says, are we there where Alabama is in terms of that total number of draft picks on defense? No, but we want to get there. When you fast forward now to late February of 2019, I would think it's safe to say, easy to say, that Georgia's a lot closer to being there now than it was when Kirby Smart said that. And the heartbreaking losses that Georgia suffered to Alabama the last couple of seasons don't change the overall trajectory of the direction in which Georgia's growing. growing towards the kind of program that from a talent standpoint really is on par with Alabama, and there should be no reason to doubt when these two programs go head-to-head from the standpoint of a Georgia fan, despite the fact that Georgia's lost the last couple of games. And you know what? Even Nick Saban himself has noticed this, because when he's been quizzed before by the ESPN folks, I mean, he said he expects to see these kinds of Georgia-Alabama battles to happen many times in the years to come. Here's Nick Saban.
I know what they're doing and how they're doing it. They're going to be successful for a long time.
Look, so let me wrap this entire conversation up. I go on Alabama radio shows from time to time, and I get asked a question of some version like this. B.A., when Georgia comes this close to Alabama the last couple of years and doesn't win that game, is there any fear on the part of fans that if you couldn't get over the hump in 2017, you couldn't get over the hump in 2018? Is there any fear on the part of Georgia fans that Georgia may never get over the hump? And my honest answer back to that is no, it shouldn't be. I don't think that scarcity is something that Georgia has to worry about when it comes to its battle with Alabama. If anything, the scarcity here is on the other side. It's Nick Saban who is, as I've said before, is getting into the winter of his career. It's him who gets a little bit older every single day. It's him who has to retool and overhaul his coaching staff now 2 consecutive off seasons. If anything, the Georgia plan that's been put in place is very much on the schedule that Kirby Smart had it designed to be, bringing in more and more elite talent every single year. I can't tell you when the breakthrough for Georgia is going to occur against Alabama, but I can say with some confidence that I don't believe there's any kind of mental barrier that's keeping this from happening. I think Georgia's adding to its talent every single year. 2019 is another example of that, and maybe, just maybe, this will be the year that the breakthrough finally does occur for the Dogs. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, and thank you so much for being with us live on video today, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube. We're also available on the DawgNation Twitter feed. We're on the radio at noon as well. We love being with our friends in the Classic City on 960 The Ref each and every day. We are also available as a podcast. If you're normally a video listener and you want a great on-demand way to catch up with the program if you ever miss an episode, subscribe to the podcast on the Apple Podcast Player. We think that's a really good way to catch up with DawgNation Daily. We'd love to have you do that there. We also post the show each and every day on the world-famous DawgNation.com. It is a Tuesday. That means for us, coming up in a couple of minutes, we'll get some recruiting talk coming up with Jeff Sentell. Before we do that, though, I do want to go around the Doghouse today, presented by Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa in beautiful Towns County, Georgia. And I want to backtrack on something we talked about a little bit yesterday. I addressed yesterday what I thought were the 5 toughest games for Georgia on its 2019 schedule. And there was a clear theme that I had in mind for ranking the games that I ranked, but I also invited some comments about this as well. And I heard some great stuff on our comment section on video yesterday. We do our R.S. Andrews cool down at the end of each show, and we had some great discussion on this. I knew I'd get some great Twitter responses, and I got some of those as well at DawgNation Daily. In fact, Scott Barman weighed in on this at the DawgNation Daily on the DawgNation Daily Twitter feed. And in fact, here's what Scott said. He said, "Hey, DawgNation Daily, in terms of the toughest game for Georgia in 2019, he says, I think it's going to be Tennessee and Knoxville, the week after the Notre Dame game. Kirby will have to work to prevent a letdown." Now, some people accurately pointed out to both Scott and me that don't forget there is that bye week before the Tennessee game this year. But I think that Scott's overall point is still an interesting one, that there's going to be so much hype and interest in just general focus on that Notre Dame game. What happens after that, kind of getting back up for the rest of the schedule run, will be a little bit of a challenge for UGA, and I think that Scott's not incorrect for pointing that out. Another thing that I got some pushback on from some of you, both in terms of Facebook comments, Twitter mentions, things of that nature, is the fact that I was putting too much emphasis on Georgia going on the road in 2019. I mentioned the Auburn game up near the top of that list, the Tennessee game up near the top of that list, because they were true road games for Georgia, and this is an area in which we've seen Georgia struggle in the past. Some of you said I'm making too much of that, but listen, the nightmare that was Georgia and Jordan-Hare Stadium in Auburn in 2017, that still hangs over my head a bit. I mean, if anything, Kirby Smart tried to send the warning out to Georgia before that game, but the results ultimately ended up being what they were. In fact, here is what Kirby tried to tell Georgia fans and his team before going into a really tough road environment in Jordan-Hare Stadium that day. Here's Kirby Smart.
Well, it's the same challenge as it is at most SEC places. It's just a little bit louder. And they're they got a good team. I mean, the better the team is, the tougher the place to play is, and their fans get loud, get rowdy. They're there pregame to the end, and there have been some really loud moments playing in that stadium, and I don't expect it to be any different Saturday.
That was an unfortunately prophetic statement from Kirby Smart going into that 2017 game against Auburn, because that day Georgia did not seem to respond well to the road atmosphere it faced. And what was weird, almost a carbon copy of that was October of 2018. Despite the fact there were about 20,000 Georgia fans in Baton Rouge against LSU, once again, Kirby Smart sent out the warning pregame of be careful with this hostile crowd, but nonetheless, it still ended up being a big factor in the game. Here's Kirby from last October.
I mean, every environment in the SEC is incredible, but this is one of the best in the country. It always is. Their fan base cares so much. They tailgate. I mean, they're the center attraction of the show, you know, and played there as a player, coached there a lot of times, and it's a great program, great atmosphere. I mean, they're loud, their fans are passionate, and they're physical. They got a good program.
So if you missed the conversation from yesterday's program, I'll invite you to check that out, our most recent episode of DawgNation Daily, where I rank my 5 toughest games, and I am going to have those true road tests, given the fact that Georgia didn't get it done last year at LSU or didn't get it done at Auburn in 2017. Those games where Georgia goes on the road expecting to face a hostile crowd here in 2019, those are going to be important games for me to see how much Georgia is growing as Kirby Smart moves into what I guess will be year 4 here in 2019. I'm eager to see that, and that's why I'm going to rank those games where I do. I'd love to have you continue to weigh in either in our video comment section now or on Twitter at DawgNation Daily as a part of Around the Doghouse, presented today by Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. And speaking of Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa, what a great time to check that out. If you're watching on video, you see some of the images from that beautiful resort there in Towns County, Georgia, the rolling hills, the mountains, the trees. Maybe I have a little bit of spring fever, but watching this video today really makes me eager to kind of get away and be at a place like this. And there's no better place for you to go this time of year than Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. You can find them on the web at brasstownvalley.com. You can find out about special offers they have going on, or just some of the amenities that make Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa such a great getaway. It's only 2 hours from Atlanta, but when you get there, I say this from time to time, and it really is true, when you get there, you kind of feel like you're a world away just because of how nestled in and tucked in it is in those beautiful mountains. So please check out Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. It's great to have them as a part of Around the Doghouse here on DawgNation Daily. All right, coming up later on, ESPN also said something else that was pretty interesting about Georgia yesterday, and I want to get into that in terms of how that might impact Georgia in the 2019 season. But for now, a lot on recruiting, everything going on with the build-up to the kind of the heart of the 2020 recruiting cycle. Jeff Sentell's got a lot on that. We'll welcome him into the program right now, and it's great to have you with us as well.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Happy Tuesday to you, Jeff Sentell. Thanks for being with us on the Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All. We do love getting a chance to get some of your inside info about Georgia recruiting. And speaking of inside stuff, if you want to become a Marlowe's insider, the best way to do that is text the word Marlowe's to that's M-A-R-L-O-W-S, M-A-R-L-O-W-S to 24242. And you can become a Marlowe's Tavern insider today. Jeff Sentell, good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, Brandon, man. Good morning, guys. This is maybe getting to be starting the time of year where I don't know if our DawgNation.com readers would like to see 7 or 8 stories on recruiting up every day on the site, but I guess we could sure try.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about some of the stuff you've got coming up because you've got some really interesting stuff either already up at DawgNation.com or set to come in the kind of hours and days ahead. I want to do some of that with us today as a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All. But let me start, though, with something that you and I talked about off the air a little bit yesterday. And I think sometimes we see stories kind of pop up, and a lot of this, in this day and age, happens through social media. And I think it's important to give some context for that. For instance, Jamil Burroughs is, I believe, one of the centerpieces of Georgia's 2020 class, a terrific defensive line prospect, a guy who I believe is all dog, and yet over the course of the weekend there was a tweet from Burroughs that got some attention. I think for those watching on video we can show this. He goes on an LSU visit, was very complimentary of the visit, describes it as one of the best that he's been on, and yeah, there it is on the screen. He says, one of the best visits I've taken so far. That's Jamil Burroughs with the sort of signature LSU gear and symbols behind him. Jeff, help us make sense of something like this, because obviously visits are just a part of life for a program like Georgia. When it wants to compete for the top recruits, they are not going to shut it down and not take visits. So help us contextualize what it means for what we believe a rock-solid UGA commit enjoying his time at a place like LSU, and kind of what all of this means.
Hey, Brandon, let's have fun with this. First of all, there's the easy way to say this is, it's sort of like recruit has a visit to an SEC program, enjoys visits, tweets out complimentary things about the visit. I mean, there's some semblance of that to this story, of course, but I mean, the thing that Georgia fans are gonna probably think about here was not the ONG crazy purple emoji face here, but Jamil Burroughs is one of those cornerstone recruits for Georgia, strongly committed to Georgia. Things can change with young people all the time, but he, to me, seems like one of those bedrock cornerstone commitments for Georgia, especially when Georgia's going to turn over what looks to me to be like 10 defensive linemen over the next 2 years, where Jamil Burroughs is not only having dream school, home state school, in-state school, but the path to playing time for a national championship contender is all there. So all that stuff you got to think about, the need for the class, but also where Jamil Burroughs rates as a true cornerstone commitment for the class. Now, it's interesting, my friend. Like, I know I like to have fun with you. What Georgia does with a lot of these recruits is they say, hey, man, go see the world. Go see everything else out there. Go see everything, compare it to Georgia, and we want to get a shot to make sure that you still like us the best, and you come back home after those visits and compare us. They do that with their recruits, even the elite recruits. Right? And I know if you were the head coach or the lead recruiter at the University of Georgia, I don't know if you'd be telling guys to go visit Clemson and go visit Florida. But that's the way Georgia operates, even with a priority position for the 2020 class.
Well, you mentioned Clemson. I feel like I am honest enough to admit that as a fan, if you gave me the choice of Georgia doing things the way that it does or being a fan of a program like Clemson that does things the way that it does, and listen, Clemson's method is working. It's won the most recent national championship. It's been a fixture in the college football playoff. But this thing where, hey, Clemson commits, don't take other visits, but Clemson also doesn't host a guy on a visit unless he's, uncommitted from a program, that's not full contact enough for me. I mean, I do want to play in this kind of ruthless, cutthroat, hey, let's try to steal everybody else's recruits and let's try to, feel confident enough that no one's going to steal the ones that Georgia really wants to keep. I mean, I'm wired in such a way that the really aggressive, full combat, hand-to-hand method of Georgia recruiting is preferable to me than the kind of touchy-feely, everybody let's all hug and kumbaya Clemson recruiting. I wouldn't like being a Clemson fan knowing that other people around me were just being more aggressive than me. Right or wrong, I'm kind of wired to be more of a fan of Georgia's pursuits than I am a program like Clemson's pursuits, who is a lot less aggressive. Still getting elite players, but they just go about it in a lot less aggressive way. That way is kind of not for me, Jeff. I don't mind telling you the truth about that.
Well, I guess let's put the proper hues of purple and orange to this. With Clemson, Dabo Swinney and his staff, they do like to have their guys figured out by summer. They like to have their commitments made by summer, especially the end of the summer, especially the end of their camping cycle. And then everything that takes place out of that is they will welcome commitments from other schools to work out or to come by on unofficials. But then, especially once the season gets underway and things get really, really meaty, they won't welcome official visits from prospects that are committed elsewhere. If prospects that are committed elsewhere want to take an official visit to Clemson, that's great. The first thing they got to do is make a public decommitment from their school. And the other thing is, if one of Clemson's commitments wants to go take an official visit and go check out another school, that's fine as well. Dabo leaves the doors wide open. They just have to decommit first from Clemson. That's the way Clemson does it. There's a lot of kumbaya. There's a lot of water slides to that. And I guess everything else that goes with horseshoes and bowling with the Clemson program, which is a fantastic program that is winning at a level that even Georgia fans would probably not get overindulged on for quite a few years. So credit to Dabo, definitely works. Definitely takes a little bit less of the intrigue or maybe wet nursing out of the recruits during the balance of that very rigorous ACC season, air quotes, in when they're trying to win championships.
It is Jeff Sentell as part of our Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All here on DawgNation Daily. Don't forget, just in the same way that Jeff gives us inside info in UGA recruiting, you can become an insider at Marlowe's yourself by texting the word Marlowe's. That's MARLOWS to 24242. That's the number, 24242. Marlowe's is the word. You can find out about special offers and big events happening in the tavern right there in your neighborhood. Jeff, let me switch gears here for a moment. I saw on Twitter where Mikael Sherman, the five-star linebacker from that D.C. area, an important part of the Georgia recruiting cycle here for 2020, I guess is also celebrating a birthday today. So I guess happy birthday to Mikael Sherman, who turned 17. And I can't help but notice, Jeff, that every time we do our top targets for the 2020 class as a part of Before the Hedges each and every Wednesday, you're always really, really keen on making sure that Sherman gets a lot of attention in those top targets lists for Georgia. So on the event of his birthday, would you mind kind of giving us an update on Sherman and kind of how you view him and how he fits into the overall puzzle for Georgia here in 2020?
Sure. First of all, he was named to the opening as a junior. Everybody that follows our coverage on DawgNation, they know about the opening, and they know about guys that get invited to the Nike opening a cycle in advance of their senior season, when mostly there's 166 of the nation's top recruits that all compete together at a Nike event with lots of gear and lots of swag. And usually they only save about 6 spots for underclassmen. Very rare to see sophomores there. Owen Pappoe was the only one of those. Juniors like Jamarian Salyer and Nolan Smith also made the trip on their way to Georgia. Brian Brzee was another guy that was a junior participant in the opening last year. Mikael Sherman, 6'3", about 220, recovering from a season-ending knee injury as a junior. Let me tell you, Sherman, the thing that will make you, let me just say, the tantalizing thoughts here about Mikael Sherman is 6'3", 230, can play inside or outside, kind of like Quay Walker a little bit. He is a guy, though, when Nike had their fastest man competition, and listen, that's normally receivers, all-purpose backs, scat backs, maybe even a rare quarterback or something like that. Mikael Sherman was not only in that thing, he clocked the fastest time of any linebacker at the Nike opening fastest man competition. He made one of the final heats. He clocked a 4.52, 4.53 on the laser at that speed, which is moving down the road. Let me say that one more time. And he's a guy that we've seen the Twitter video of him recently. He's already bouncing back strong from that knee injury. And he's a guy, we wrote about this last week, that DMV fishing hole for Georgia in 2020. He's one of several stellar elite recruits that do have Georgia on their mind. And one of these days we'll get around to sharing that story about Mikael Sherman and that conversation he had with Todd Gurley at a camp about Georgia. Very interesting story that I think Georgia has definitely been very high up there for Sherman for quite a long while now. And then everybody saw the tweet recently where he applauded the hire of Dan Lanning as defensive coordinator for Georgia. And Dan Lanning has been his vigilant recruiter trying to entice him to come down and visit Georgia, check out Georgia for over 14 months now.
Now, you know that we're still really, really early in this 2020 cycle, Jeff, but use a word like tantalizing. When you start mentioning, hey, connection with Todd Gurley, kind of a favorable conversation these two have had in the past, Sherman being impressed with the Dan Lanning hire, that's certainly going to tantalize a lot of folks when it comes to Mikael Sherman. You know what you've done here. You've kind of fanned the flames a little bit.
Hey, one more. He's going to visit Georgia this weekend as well. I don't know if they'll have a late birthday party for him or anything else like that, but I bet there will be some pictures of him in Georgia gear as well. Sherman's just a really strong player. One of those guys, and you sit there and go, gee willikers, man, good gosh almighty, Joe Friday. How in the world can Georgia get another outside linebacker to come into the fold with the Nolan Smiths, the Jermaine Johnsons, the Ojularis of the world? But that's what this recruiting staff does.
On an unofficial visit, can they give him the official visit-style cookie cake in honor of his birthday? I mean, surely that's not an NCAA violation to give a young man a birthday cake, is it? Surely not.
Oh, man, it's another example. I mean, you're going to see this young man, and he just turned 17, man, 6'3", 230. Looks like he could be on a college campus right now doing power cleans, being in one of those Attack the Day snippet videos that Georgia sends out on Twitter. We rank him in the top 8 or 9 targets for Georgia in the 2020 class, not just because he's a 5-star, not just because he would check a need, a very small need these days at outside linebacker for Georgia. But Mikael Sherman is just a guy that Georgia has been building a relationship with. I mean, really essentially since Dan Lanning came on staff. He's been bird-dogging that guy up in the D.C. area along with Demon Clowney and everything else like that. And this is a great way Georgia's worked. Everybody sometimes wonders if Kirby Smart is being tactical enough or if he's thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead with his strategery. Well, when it comes to recruiting, getting Lanning on all these hot 2020 guys when he eventually ascends to be the defensive coordinator in waiting at the University of Georgia, and now he is the defensive coordinator at the University of Georgia. Pretty well played.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Hey, you've got a piece up at DawgNation.com right now that I want to talk about for a minute. It's the 5-star offensive tackle from the class of 2020, Broderick Jones, a UGA commit, and he's got some good news for Georgia fans. I don't want to give the whole thing away because I want people to read it at DawgNation.com, but I do believe this is a pretty important piece of news for Georgia as you start really looking ahead to the future, and it's not too early to start doing this. Give us some of the story here on Jones and how this kind of fits into the on-field story for the Dogs 2020 and beyond.
So, Brandon, here's what you'll like about this one, kind of like that shrimp and crab nacho plate you and I both love at Marlowe's, man. But here's what's happening here with Jones. Obviously, this is going to check some bells for you, check some boxes for you as well. I mean, with those green emoji checks. He's currently the only 5-star commitment for Georgia in the class. That's rare that we can say that these days. He's the number 20 overall prospect in the country. And, of course, if anybody follows their NFL draft mocks or whatever, you would realize that the names Andrew Thomas and Isaiah Wilson, those guys are going to be on draft boards or those mock draft boards all this fall, especially Andrew Thomas, man. He seemed like he's been trending to the NFL since he started all 15 games as a freshman during that Rose Bowl season in 2017. And what's going to happen there? Broderick becomes very important for the class. I mean, he's the type of guy that it's weird how this works, Brandon. It's almost like that drop-dead, stunning, gorgeous young lady in high school that is so that nobody wants to talk to her, that nobody wants to try and ask her out because she seems untouchable. And this is what we did last week, I think, or a couple weeks ago on Before the Edges, where some of these 5-star commitments on Georgia's board, like Trayvon Walker, George Pickens, Nolan Smith, they end up with right around 15 offers because no one really tries to go all in with a 5-star against all the other schools that are already really well deep into the recruitment. I think Nolan Smith only ended up with 10 published offers. I think George Pickens had 16. And what's happening here with Broderick Jones is really, to use a phrase that I know a lot of the hip folks that listen to us every day like to say is, not a lot of schools, man, are shooting a shot right now on Broderick Jones, man. It's really just, there's Georgia, Auburn and Gus Malzahn, man, they're sure trying. Yeah. Tennessee's making a push as well, but really, that's about it for a guy. You look at him, Brandon, 6'6" and maybe a quarter inch now. He continues to grow. He's in the middle of his state basketball run from Lithonia High School at 291, 292 pounds. Dude looks like he's 275, carries that weight so well. He's a starter on a Class 5A basketball team. Man, I don't know how many boxes we can check on Broderick Jones that are not already checked, but a lot of good things. And that story, the story that's up on DawgNation.com right now, kind of shows how Broderick Jones is doing everything he can to get himself in position. Should an Isaiah Wilson go to the NFL, and should Andrew Thomas go to the NFL, and maybe there's only like a proven veteran tackle like Cade Mays at the program right now at Georgia, Broderick Jones is going to get himself into position to vie for playing time for that 2020 season.
Yeah, that's a really important story to think about. It's not too early to start thinking about that because of the way, as you said, Georgia could lose offensive tackles in the season to come. That's a really, really important thing to keep your eye on. It's a great piece up right now at DawgNation.com. Jeff, something else, and we'll finish up with this for today. We could do a lot more, but we'll just finish with this. Something else that you've got coming at DawgNation.com as well, and this is a timely conversation coming off the heels of a visit for Mitchell Mays, the 4-star offensive lineman from North Carolina, who was recently on campus there at of Georgia, kind of getting the red carpet treatment. As you might imagine, Sam Pittman loves giving that out. We've become very accustomed to seeing these photos of offensive linemen smiling while standing next to Sam Pittman. Mays, I guess, becomes the latest on that. It sounds like you've got a preview coming on Mays, and this is one of those names that Georgia fans probably will spend a good bit of time getting to know in the weeks to come, it sounds like.
Okay, Brandon, stop me if you've heard this before. One other thing to add on Broderick, which we'll add to this conversation we're about to have on Mitchell Mays, is Broderick is at the point now where I think the coaches are probably going to start asking him to start talking to guys and building the class, kind of being one of those Pied Piper that, you know, Brandon likes to hear about, those Pied Pipers. And I think 5-star Pied Pipers can toot the University of Georgia horn very loudly when it comes to a future and a playing future at the University of Georgia. I know a lot of fans would like to see Broderick Jones and Tate Ratledge show up in this class, in the 2020 class. But another name here, to stay on subject here and on book, is Mitchell Mays. And stop me if you haven't heard this one before, Brandon, but this might be Sam Pittman in Georgia going against Clemson again for another big guy.
Amazing.
Mitchell Mays is a top 50 player, number 3 overall offensive tackle at the University of Georgia. And let me tell you this, and let me tell you this very slowly, for any maybe Georgia Tech fans or any other fans of the rival fan bases that are listening to this. Mitchell Mays looks older than I think about 85% of the Georgia roster and maybe several graduate assistants.
Wow.
He's just 16, and he will be 17 on September the 30th. People call him Unc. They call him Uncle Mitch because, or Big Mitch because he is a huge guy. There's a lot to like about Mitchell Mays. He's already very fond of Georgia. He took a trip to Georgia over the weekend. He already knows when he'll be back. We'll write about when he'll be back at Georgia for his next visit upon the heels of this already successful visit. Out of North Carolina, Clemson really likes him a lot, and will be very interesting because this is a guy. You get on the DawgNation forum, you already know a couple things about the offensive line class for Georgia. You know that Georgia wants to get at least 2 tackles. Broderick Jones is one of those dudes right there. And then they want to look for more of those Swiss Army knife players. We use that a lot and say that a lot about a lot of positions at Georgia. The defensive backfield, the secondary, the offensive line fits there too. Because I think this staff has grown enamored of what they saw out of Cade Mays last year. A guy that could play tackle, a guy that could play guard, a guy that can kind of plug and play with the rigors of the SEC at a high level when the attrition comes across the offensive line. And I think they look at Mitchell Mays and they see another player that can do all those things.
That's a really interesting thing to bring up, Jeff, and I'm glad to have that as part of our conversation here. We'll look forward to reading a lot more from you on that at DawgNation.com. Of course, the Sentell Intel pieces and everything else there. A lot of really good recruiting stuff coming down the pipe here very soon. Thanks for being with us as part of our Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All today. Jeff, before we let you go, I'll remind folks to become a Marlowe's Insider by texting the word Marlowe's, no apostrophe, just M-A-R-L-O-W-S, to 24242. That is the number to know there. And you can find out about big events and special offers happening at the tavern right there in your neighborhood. Jeff, I'll also look forward to seeing you tomorrow afternoon for Before the Hedges, presented by Kroger, starting at 3 p.m. And it sounds like it's going to be a very spirited show, just given everything else that's going on with the UGA recruiting right now.
Hey, man, Brandon, Marlowe's is known for that quality, great, 5-star chef-inspired food, and I'll return you to keep cooking up another great show.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Good stuff from Jeff Sentell, and I think what he says there at the end about Cade Mays is really pretty fascinating. I think I'm going to do some more on that before we're done here today, because there is an issue in which the Jeff Sentell has been kind of ringing the bell on, maybe more so than anybody else, and I think he's right about this. I don't think any of us pay enough attention to this, but I'll do more of that later on in our program. For now, though, I want to give full time for our SEC Through, because there's actually a couple pretty interesting stories going on around the SEC right now. Let me start where I don't always go, and that's basketball. So Tennessee loses to LSU. LSU's got a good team, but Tennessee lost and wasn't too happy about it. There's even been some research done about one of the officials in the game calling way more fouls than the other officials involved and calling way more of those at the expense of Tennessee. Well, come to find out, we learned more about this guy. Clay Travis on Twitter tweeted this out. This has also been shared by a couple of the websites as well, including CBSSports.com. So Anthony Jordan's the guy's name. This is the official in question who was very aggressive in terms of calling fouls against Tennessee in the game this past Saturday. And he got a Facebook post. I believe this has since been deleted, but the screen grab is out there on the internet forever. And it's Anthony Jordan on Facebook saying, strolling through D-Town, Granada, doing a little sightseeing, and look what I saw. To all my Bamas, go Tigers with the customary spelling, G-A-U-X, and he's holding up the LSU T-shirt. Now, it don't take much around the SEC, and this is an example of that, of a referee who was already a little bit controversial for the way that he called the game, to then be seen photographed holding up the LSU shirt. A lot of Tennessee fans feel like the official was on the take. And I got to tell you, this is a really, really bad look for the SEC. In a weird way, this is more harmful, I believe, than I know there was that kind of reemergence of the Tim Donaghy, the scandal in the NBA about the referee who was allegedly fixing games from a gambling standpoint. In the SEC, having a official who was also a fan, I think, is a bigger deal and potentially more harmful to the SEC's credibility than the stuff going on with the alleged gambling kind of stuff. I think this is the kind of thing that the SEC has got to be very careful about, because there are no shortage of fan bases that get upset about certain things that happen in a game. And for the most part, we see this even with like the Rams-Saints thing that happened the other day, where there was an egregious missed call. The Saints fans were very upset about it. But time and time again, no matter how upset a fan base gets about a call that goes against them, the sports fans outside that fan base don't really care. And the assumption always is, I know you think you were jobbed, but you really weren't, officiating. These people are human, on blah, blah, blah. But when you're a human, you're also, I guess, prone to have a team that you cheer for. You're prone to have a life outside of officiating. When that creeps into the world of being what might be an LSU fan here, I think this is a potential bad look for the SEC. They got to do something about this. I don't quite know. As the saying goes, it's not paranoia if they really are out to get you. In the case of Tennessee fans here, maybe this guy really was out to get them. This is something for the SEC to be very careful about, I believe. Speaking of being careful, Auburn might want to be careful with this. Darius Slayton, former Auburn wide receiver, was quoted at AL.com. That's the big website that covers Alabama and Auburn. And while Slayton, for the most part, is complimentary of his time at Auburn and has some love and affection for the program, there's one thing that he says that will be, I think, used against Auburn in the court of public opinion when it comes to negative recruiting. Let me show you the quote here from Darius Slayton about why he's going to the NFL draft, even though he may not be drafted very high. It's about how he was used at Auburn. Slayton says, I think I had a chance to make plays at Auburn, he means, but I definitely think I didn't always get a chance to show my full ability of what I'm capable of doing. That's Darius Slayton being quoted as a part of a special piece at AL.com. Far be it from me to tell Kirby Smart and these other SEC coaches how to go about their business, but for a program like Auburn, who's already on kind of shaky footing, I'm printing this thing up and I'm passing this thing around to any would-be wide receiver. George Pickens already chose Georgia over Auburn, but the next version of George Pickens, the next version of elite receiver, considering going to Auburn, the same way that Auburn loses out on Pickens for this class, lost out on Justin Ross for the 2018 class, I think the words of Darius Slayton, even though I don't know that he necessarily means to disparage Auburn, this is going to be used to disparage Auburn. I think it probably should be. That this is a program that is just so intertwined in Malzahn's own mercurial ways of running an offense that it's not developing stars the way that it should at the wide receiver position. Now, Georgia's got its own issues with that. I won't deny that. But so far, you don't have Mikael Hardman or Riley Ridley or Terry Godwin, any of the departed Georgia wide receivers saying, now in Godwin's case, his eligibility was done, but you don't have Hardman or Ridley saying, I'm leaving Georgia because they didn't use me effectively, and hopefully they never do, because I don't think that's a particular good look for a program when you get ready to move out of it. A couple of the other SEC stories I want to get to. First of all, I talked yesterday about the recent decommitment from the Florida program. They've had two within like the last week or so. I also saw on some Florida message boards yesterday, Gators fans are not happy about the latest one. Kevon Lee, who's really kind of a running back, he's kind of mentioned either as an athlete or an all-purpose back in some, categories. But this is a guy that, was potentially going to be right there along with DeMarcus Bowman, one of those running back prospects that Florida was really chasing down. There's always a chance, I guess, he gravitates back towards Florida before it's all said and done. But if you like the idea of Gators fans being very nervous right now and very worried and bothered, the Lee decommitment has them feeling that way. And listen, around here, we're Gator haters. We think if Florida's upset, we're happy. And so we're certainly happy about that. And then one final story to get to, and this is kind of in the weeds a little bit, but I wanted to bring it up nonetheless. I don't know what's going on at LSU, but there are more break-ins at LSU football stadium than any other SEC stadium combined. The latest, according to the Baton Rouge Advocate, is that I guess it's 3 guys. They're young guys. We don't know if they're LSU students. They break into the LSU locker room, steal one of those John Deere-type vehicles, and drive the thing around campus. I want to say there have been like a half dozen instances of people breaking into Tiger Stadium there in Baton Rouge and just trespassing on the field. And now you got guys breaking in the locker room, stealing a John Deere vehicle. What is it about LSU? Are they not locking the facility? I swear this only happens in Baton Rouge. It's kind of an amazing situation. Maybe that tells you a little bit about what's going on in the state of Louisiana too, I guess. Nonetheless, we'll make that your SEC through. All right, here on DawgNation Daily, I want to get back to what we started the show talking about. We were talking about the ESPN pre-spring preview for the Georgia Bulldogs, and off the top of the program, I addressed whether or not there might be some sort of mental hurdle for Georgia to get over when it comes to Alabama. I'd love to hear from you on that, your thoughts about the potential mental barrier you think that Georgia might have. You can reach out to me either on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. We'll do our R.S. Andrews cool down after the show on video. You can put your comments in there. You can also comment when we post the podcast at the world-famous DawgNation.com. A lot of ways for you to interact. I'd love to hear from you on that. The other thing, though, about the ESPN preview of Georgia that I thought was worth mentioning is how similar the kind of key issue that ESPN identifies is to something we've talked about on this program a lot, and that's the need for the emergence of what they call pass catchers, new receivers to step up. Georgia's losing Riley Ridley. Georgia's losing McCole Hardman. They're leaving school early. Terry Godwin, as we said, his eligibility is done. Also adding to this, Isaac Nada as well. Georgia needs some new pass-catching threats to emerge. That's going to be a big part of the conversation this spring. But in doing that, I think it's important to remember that while someone like me quickly gravitates towards George Pickens, we talked about Pickens yesterday, him being one of those guys that step up, I'm still a big believer that the former 5-star Demetrius Robertson, after being a freshman All-American at Cal, he could also be one of these guys that emerges in a big way in 2019. But if Kirby Smart was here, though, when it comes to this competition for new pass catchers that ESPN highlights and my kind of steadfast belief that it's the elite prospects who are the most likely to emerge, Kirby Smart would say don't be so quick to assume that it's not necessarily the 5-star receivers who are going to be the ones that step up and win in a competition like this. In fact, here's how he said that last summer.
How they came in does not matter to us. That means nothing in that room. Every time you guys print something about receivers, it's about how many 5-stars are in there. But the guys that are playing best right now in there, none of them had 5 stars. So we go off performance. I mean, the receiver position is where do you help the team the most? Can you cover a kick? Can you block somebody? Can you make a play outside on the perimeter that nobody can make? And right now, that has nothing to do with what you were regarded as coming in. So is the culture of competition good? Absolutely. Because maybe those guys that were 3 stars and 4 stars have outworked the guys that were 5, because none of that makes a decision for us. All we do is say, who's playing well? And right now, the guys that are playing best at receiver were not the highly regarded guys.
And to back that up, on the field this season, we saw that from J.J. Holloman, not a former 5-star receiver. We saw that at times from Tyler Simmons, not a former 5-star receiver. Those guys stepped up and really did earn playing time when they won that competition. Here's more from Kirby on that subject.
We're going to play the guys that play the best. We're going to play the guys that practice the best. We're going to play the guys that bust their butt and go out there and help the team. And there's a lot of them that are helping on special teams. I'm very pleased with our receiver room. Top to bottom, I think they're competing hard. They're playing hard. They're making good plays, and they're really helping on special teams. But it's what they came in as. I'm not into that. I'm into the team environment. Can you help our team? And if you can, then I'm going to reward you by helping our team. But not, I can't promise you a number of touches and catches. The goal is to win the game.
So as much as Kirby Smart says that, the names I'm still the most excited about are guys like George Pickens and guys like Demetrius Robertson. I do have big expectations for them this year, but Kirby's words can't be discounted either, because a guy like J.J. Holloman, through hard work and effort, did emerge in 2018. I expect more from him in 2019 as well. The overall bottom line of that discussion is I think that ESPN's right. When it comes to spring practice storylines, how the competition for wide receivers plays out, I think it'll go a long way towards telling you how good Georgia could be this upcoming season. Pretty fun stuff. Make sure you read that at ESPN.com. And, of course, we've got a long spring preview series running at DawgNation.com, too, you're going to want to check out as well. Something else that'll make you happy here. How about the fact that it's now been 850 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs? That's good news. It's our Gator Hater Updater. And don't forget to check out Jeff Sentell's piece on Broderick Jones. Jones is an early enrollee. That could be good news for Georgia in 2020, and it's not too early to start thinking about that. We'll see you tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily. And on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. I love this part of the day. Your chance to react and discuss everything going on with UGA athletics is always a lot of fun. And, of course, no matter the weather, the ones we trust when it comes to stuff going on with our house are our friends at R.S. Andrews. They're the ones we would recommend because they're the you call, we come, it's fixed. Simple as that, folks. They arrive when promised. They do only the work that's needed for an upfront, guaranteed, no surprise price. That's heating, that's air conditioning, that's plumbing, that's electric. As I like to say, they're the ones we trust to play all the positions. It's R.S. Andrews. You can find them online at rsandrews.com, and they bring the R.S. Andrews cool down to you each and every day here on DawgNation Daily. So there are a couple of things I'd love for us to talk about right now. One of those things is the notion of mental hurdle. I don't believe that's what Georgia faced when it comes to Alabama. I still think this is a very tangible, real talent conversation. Georgia's climbing that ladder of getting closer and closer to the Crimson Tide every single year. But ultimately, the thing that's going to push Georgia over the top is the elite talent that it's collecting, not some sort of hypnosis, is that the right word? Hypnotized about this mental hurdle against Alabama. I don't necessarily believe that exists. For me, this is more about the tangible stuff on the field with the talent. I'd love to have you weigh in on that. I think that the situation with wide receivers is also really interesting, too. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And pay close attention to something else that Jeff Sentell brought up, and he's brought this up a lot. And as I've said before, this is one of those things that he's talked about probably more than others, but it's worth noticing. Georgia, if Andrew Thomas almost certainly leaving after this season, Isaiah Wilson will at least face a choice. Maybe he doesn't leave, but even if Wilson stays, Georgia is a lot thinner right now at offensive tackle than it is at the other offensive line positions. And as great as Georgia's offensive line recruiting has been, the offensive tackle position is not quite as deep as those interior offensive linemen are. That means guys that you brought in for this year's class, the Warren McClendons, the Xavier Trusses, you need them to develop. An Owen Condon, who did get a chance to travel with Georgia some last year, you need him to develop. And it's not too early to start thinking about a guy like Broderick Jones coming in 2020 being ready to compete for some early playing time, because Georgia may need tackles by the time you get to that 2020 season. I love the idea of Cade Mays being a little bit of a Swiss Army knife. We're in kind of an era of positionless players in a lot of sports. Baseball and basketball have their own version of that. Maybe the offensive line, to a certain extent, is going that way a bit too. But for Georgia, there is still some value. There is still, I think, premium value in being a true, legit offensive tackle. I think you need those guys, and maybe Mays growing into that for Georgia, being a true tackle, especially by the time that Thomas and Wilson's era comes to an end. That may be an important thing to think about. So you can weigh in on all of that, or really anything else you want to discuss on today's program. Alan McGovern says about the Georgia-Alabama thing, he says it is mental, all right. It's mental lapses on the field, can't be the best until ... I get that. That's a fair point. I'm sure many people agree with you. I think, though, the misunderstanding there is the closeness to perfection that's required by Georgia or anybody to beat Alabama, given how talented they are. I think that mental mistakes, lapses in judgment, I think are a factor in every single game against every single opponent. But for the most part, Georgia is usually winning games by 2 touchdowns, so therefore you don't notice it as much. Georgia's just against opponents who are overmatched. I think you notice those. They're magnified more against Alabama because the margin for error seems so thin. And I think that has a tendency to make you think that the mental stuff is more important than it really is, or that they somehow have the hang-up, the perception of that is greater than it really is. Now, obviously, it would have been better for Georgia in 2018 had it not desperately tried to fake a punt on 4th and 11. I won't deny that. That was a bad blunder. But overall, I still think you see Georgia over the course of Kirby, who's just going into his 4th year, by the way, who is on a pretty lightning-fast trajectory towards building a program that certainly rivals Alabama from a talent standpoint. And that's the story for me that matters more than anything else, not the fact that Georgia's come up just short the last couple of years. I think Alabama fans take way too much comfort in that. Maurice Carter says, BA, I seriously believe that the wide receiver core Georgia has coming into the season will be the most complete, dominant group of wide receivers it has had in a long time. Boy, that's an interesting thing to think about, Maurice. That's a really good prediction. It's easy to understand where that comes from because you do have a nice combination of kind of interesting names. You've got the, guys who are, that sort of elite top-end talent, like a Pickens, assuming all works out with him, like a Robertson, assuming he's ready to take the next step with his development at Georgia. But you've also got the guys who've kind of worked to get to the spot where they are, the Hollemans, the Tyler Simmons. There was a thread in the forum the other day, and I think I'm going to talk about this on the regular show at some point in time. But there was a thread on the forum the other day about, let's not forget Kearis Jackson in this conversation too. I think that Jackson is a really interesting athlete. And in the discussion of, who are going to be the top receivers for Georgia, we probably don't pay enough attention to Kearis Jackson, who I do think could be heard from in that talk for sure. And then, of course, you got, as somebody's mentioned here, let me see if I can find this. Michael Toole says, don't forget about Matt Landers. Don't forget about Lawrence Cager, the transfer from Miami. Obviously, Tommy Bush comes in that discussion a bit too. Matt Rugavina says the knock on Cager from Miami is that he can't catch, and maybe that's been an issue from time to time, but he still caught 6 touchdowns. So while the productivity may not have been as high as it could have been, it's hard to dispute that he was a pretty productive player, and I think that speaks well when you look for that kind of veteran presence. John B. Mahan has an interesting take. He says when it comes to Alabama, it's mental amongst the coaches is what I see. Kirby's making the mistakes by not overruling some of the predictable calls and fake punts. I hope he learns. When it comes to the fake punt thing, I certainly hope Georgia learns from that. Those kinds of trick plays are not the kind of thing I want to see Georgia doing. I've been pretty consistent, I think, on that kind of thing. James Crump says Georgia normally has a weakness at one position or another under Rick. Smart does not have any weaknesses on this team, but there are areas for improvement. Huge difference between weaknesses and improvement. I think that James is right about that. When you look at the previous regime, as much as I like Mark Richt, there were those virtually every single season, those sort of red areas on the roster where you say, oh, this is a position group that can be exploited. And against a good team, they're going to find that, and they are going to exploit it. And that's why, for the most part, Georgia would be very good, but stop just short of being great. Kirby Smart's eliminating those weaknesses right now on the Georgia roster. At least he's trying his dead-level best, and so far I think he's doing pretty well towards doing that. And that's, I think, one of the ways to make the seeming mental hurdle against Alabama completely disappear. Once those gaps in roster comparison disappears, I think most people will find that the mental hurdle disappears too. Let me go over to YouTube here for a moment. Get some YouTube comments as a part of our R.S. Andrews cool down. And we appreciate you being a part of the program here today. K9 Blues says he agrees with one of the previous comments that it's more coaches than players in terms of intimidation. Who wouldn't be a little extra juiced up to go against their mentor in whom they are constantly compared? There may be some of that when it comes to Kirby Smart. I think, though, that it's easy to think that Georgia had Alabama completely on the ropes the last 2 years, but the truth is we're only talking about small, 2-touchdown or fewer deficits. It's just 13-0 in the 2017 national championship game, and just a 14-point lead for Georgia this past season. Those are not insurmountable leads. It's easy to think, oh gosh, how could Georgia have squandered that, let that get away? But if you look at the entirety of a college football season, those kinds of leads get lost all the time. All the time. But I understand where you're coming from. Will Marlowe says that Lane Kiffin's going to speak at Georgia's coaching clinic. Is that really true? I hadn't heard that, if that's true. Cliff Payne says it's more about overall talent as far as depth than it is coaching. UGA's loaded and ready as far as the Jimmies and the Joes. Yeah, it's certainly getting there. And this is one of those things where I just think we are living in such an age where if you look at the preseason preview, I'm talking about the national preview, and say, who can win a national championship in college football? There have never been fewer teams capable of doing that. We are just in an age where the true possibility of success rests in so few places that it can be almost overwhelming to think about how much you have to grow as a program to become capable of doing that. Because if you're Georgia, being way more talented than most of college football doesn't do you very much good, because you don't play most of these teams. You really play the SEC teams, and you have to get over the Alabama-Clemson hump if you want to win the national championship. So it's only comparing yourself to those teams that really matters, and it's Alabama in particular because that's the one you're likely to have to play every year. When you think about the overall level of where the program's been, and to its credit, it did bounce back with a very successful 2019 class. When you think about that level, it's easy to sort of want to push the fast-forward button and say, okay, now Georgia's just as talented as Alabama, but every single player on a roster matters. And Alabama is going to be, for this upcoming year, at something close to about 80% former 4- and 5-star recruits. Now, some of those guys won't quite pan out. Most of them will, but that's the number that Georgia's still chasing in all of this. Will Marlowe says that's what Georgia football's Instagram page posted a few minutes ago. That's kind of cool to think Kiffin's coming in. He is certainly an interesting personality for sure. Kiffin's one of those guys where, obviously, as a head coach, he's got a lot of problems. There's a lot about Kiffin to not be so sure about. But as an offensive play caller, as an offensive coordinator, I think he created the perfect blueprint when he was at Alabama. He had the power running game, but he also had the up-tempo stuff with the passing game. He got a lot out of some quarterbacks who I think, for the most part, are pretty limited. Kiffin's a pretty good offensive play caller. There is no question about that. Dean Butler says, Kirby's getting the talent. We've got the young coaches. The sky's the limit. Sit back and enjoy the ride. And, Dean, if that second part proves to be true this year, where, Kirby has made a little bit of a bet on some young, inexperienced coaches. For the most part, I think it's the right decision. I think that Dan Lanning and Glenn Schumann and those guys have earned their chance. I think James Coley, who's been an offensive coordinator before, has certainly earned the right to be Georgia offensive coordinator this year. But these are guys that are not going out and stealing somebody else's big name, with the exception of Charlton Warren, which I guess kind of fits that profile a bit more. This is, let me identify talent, cultivate that talent, and then put that into a spot ready to blossom at kind of the next level of professional development. If that works out for Kirby, that's a big, big statement about just how long this thing may be able to hang around. Because, once again, I don't like to give credit to Alabama, but the one thing you have to credit is replacing assistant coaches year after year is not necessarily as easy as Alabama makes it look. You've got to be good at identifying some young, up-and-coming coaches to be able to make that work. From Saban's standpoint, he probably feels like he misidentified Tosh Lapoy. He probably feels a little bit better about Golding, the new defensive coordinator. But, the way that Kirby seems to have found a young guy hungry for a chance in Glenn Schumann, that's worked out really well. I would say that Trey Scott kind of much the same way. Scott, coaching at North Carolina, you're not bringing in the elite 5-star defensive lineman at a program like that. You have to make some guesses about what a guy's going to grow into. But Smart's been pretty good at identifying those guys. Cortez Hankton even now, a guy that I kind of wondered about, what's his role? How does he fit in to this Georgia recruiting cycle? You didn't feel like you heard his name mentioned as much as you heard some of these other Georgia assistants. Well, he's been now with the program for a while, and all of a sudden now a lot of recruits are name-checking him in terms of their reasons for liking Georgia. So seemingly right now there is a lot to like, but the way that these young Georgia assistants are ingratiating themselves to the recruits available out there and becoming kind of a part of the fabric of the Georgia football program too. Cliff Payne brings up a good point. The Alabama's been so great because of how good the second-line guys are. They can have injuries and not miss a beat. UGA is getting there, though. I agree with Cliff on all those fronts. Georgia, I think, is going in that direction, but he's right about Alabama. Go back and look at the 2014 season, for instance, and you see, I think, a perfect example of this. Ole Miss had recruited at such a level. Now, you can insert your own joke about how they did it, but they'd recruited at such a level that when you looked at, the Darian Connors and the Laramie Tunzels and the Kim Deechees, when you looked at those kinds of players, Laquan Treadwell, I guess, would have been on that team. When you look at those kinds of players, they had about put together a starting 22 that would have been about as good as the starting unit for virtually any team in the SEC. But seasons are long, and in September or early October, Ole Miss can beat Alabama. But by the time you roll into like mid-November, guys are hurt. I mean, think about how many injuries that Ole Miss dealt with that year. A lot of those elite 4- and 5-star names got hurt. And then who was left to be their backup? And in some cases, it seemed like it was a typical Ole Miss backup. And that's not going to be good enough to remain in contention in the SEC West. You're not going to be able to hold on to that same level of play. But at a place like Alabama and now a place like Georgia, you've got this level of talent that can hopefully withstand injury. Think about the injuries that Georgia dealt with on its offensive line last season. Andrew Thomas missed time. Ben Cleveland missed time. You have spots where, Lamont Gilliard would leave games. In previous seasons, had those injuries occurred, especially even the 2017 season where Georgia was good enough to go to the college football playoff, but it was a lot healthier over the course of the full year that's offensive line. Had those injuries that happened in 2018 occurred in 2017, all those great memories we have of beating Auburn in the SEC championship and going to the college football playoff and being in the Rose Bowl, that's probably not going to happen. So, Cliff on the YouTube comment section is 100% correct that it's about building the kind of depth that can withstand those injuries because they are going to come. The college football season is a stress test, and you have to be able to emerge from that stress still intact. And I think Georgia's getting to the point now where they're about ready to be able to do that. They already are in the really elite category in that, but now they're trying to push towards being better than anyone when it comes to the talent standpoint, and maybe that's where they're heading. Kevin Kennard says, it may be old news, but yesterday you talked about passing downfield, and Alabama was amongst the top of the list. Where was Clemson? Go Dogs. Clemson was not on that top 10, I don't think. So to be in the top 10 on that, you had to be somewhere in the neighborhood of like 2.5 per game or whatever. My memory is that Clemson was not near there. Connor, do you have any memory of where Clemson was on that list? But not in that sort of like 2.5, 2.6 passes of 20 or more yards downfield per game, though, right?
I am pulling it up right now.
I want to say David Hale tweeted about Lawrence in particular. One of the things that's going to hurt you on that is that Lawrence didn't become the full-time starter until later in the season, so that's going to impact the numbers. You probably saw those get better over the course of the year when it comes to Clemson, but that's a good question.
Yeah, Clemson is not in that top 10.
Yeah. David Hale did, I think, tweet about both Kelly Bryant and...
But, yeah, so we do have the tweet. Trevor Lawrence this past season, 23 of 54 for 43 completion percentage, 9 touchdowns, 2 interceptions.
So think about that now. In a less than a full season starting, he had 9 touchdowns on passes of 20 or more yards down the field. That's pretty impressive. Kelly Bryant, I imagine, was nowhere near that. Bryant should be right there, I think.
Oh, Bryant as well. Bryant was – hold on. Bryant, this is 17 and 18.
Okay, so that's going to be a little bit misleading then.
And 12 of 44, 27% completion percentage, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, obviously, Lawrence, when he becomes the Clemson quarterback, makes up a lot of ground really quickly. So they won't make that for the full season because you didn't have the full year of Lawrence. But you see once he did come in how special he was. I just think that those – Bill Connolly's done some good writing on this. And as I say all the time, I don't fully understand the math behind all of this. But there are really 2 ways to measure offense right now. And then if you want to be great offensively, you've got to be good at 2 things at once. You've got to be good at staying on schedule, which means you get 5 yards on first down, you get another couple on second down, and you move the chains on third down. But you've also got to be explosive. And explosive your explosion can be measured by the total number of 20-plus yard plays you have or the number of points you score per drive. There are a couple different ways to measure that. But you've got to be good at both. I think it's probably fair to say that Georgia has been really good at staying on schedule offensively. Their efficiency has been really, really good the last couple of years. I think when it comes to the big, 20-plus yard runs, I think Georgia's probably had a great number of those. But the missing piece, I believe, for this Georgia offense, and we'll keep talking about it until it comes true, I guess, is finding those explosive passing plays, those 20-plus yard passing plays, because at that point in time, you've put the defense into a decision that there's really no winning choice to be made there.
Right. And, I would say, Georgia is a better running team than Clemson is, and certainly they wanted to play that way. in 2018. It'll be interesting to see if they want to continue to play that way in 2019, especially because there isn't that ready-made bruiser runner that Elijah Holyfield was, and I think a big reason why Swift had the second half of the season he did, where he had 5 straight games with over 100 yards, is because Holyfield was able to, take those 4 or 5 yard carries and just really plow apart a defense that softened up the defense and kept Swift fresh. I know people might want Zamir White to be that guy, but we don't know if he can sort of handle that workload just yet.
I am glad to hear you say what you said about the Georgia running game, the Clemson running game, because I've been kind of wondering, when you look at some of these preseason lists for like Heisman and things like this, you see Travis Etienne ranked ahead of DeAndre Swift. To me, that's Etienne getting a little bit of a Clemson bounce. If you gave me the choice of, we're going to play sandlot football, I'm not taking Etienne over DeAndre Swift.
Right. Etienne benefits a lot.
Am I wrong for saying that? Because I'm taking my guy over Etienne in that case.
And Etienne benefited a lot. He had a lot of touchdowns last year, but there were a lot of short yardage touchdowns. And I think you kind of saw, if you compared Etienne's game against Alabama to Swift's game against Alabama, Swift was clearly a more dynamic player and clearly a more important piece to the Georgia offense than Etienne is to the Clemson offense.
On Facebook, Jerome Williams got an interesting comment. Actually, let me get Jerome back here. Jerome says, Jake Fromm is expecting for the offense to have more expansion. I hope it's with the tight ends in the passing game. I believe we can really create some mismatches. So a couple things I want to say about that. First of all, I agree with Jerome that while fans want everybody to have 1,000 yards and everybody to have big-time productivity, I think that there is something about throwing to a tight end that's almost more valuable than throwing to a wide receiver. I just think there's an incredible mismatch that's created when you do have tight ends on the field because of the way that it causes defenses to have to think about linebackers and safeties. It's just really hard to match up against a really good tight end. So I hope that Georgia can exploit that this year, which leads me to my second point. And I think we're going to talk about this on the regular show at some point this week about this. Charlie Werner stepping in for Isaac Nada. People think, well, Georgia doesn't really use the tight end. But if you go back and look at Nada's year this year, he was actually statistically really productive. I think it's going to be really interesting to compare Nada to a lot of previous Georgia tight ends and look at how many catches he did have, how much offense he did generate. Werner replacing Isaac Nada. Now, I think that Werner's an athletic specimen in his own right. I think he can be an NFL player himself. He's kind of one of those, tight ends that's a little bit like a wide receiver because that's kind of what he played in high school. But Werner's ability to match the offensive productivity that Nauta showed a year ago is actually, I think, one of the important questions facing Georgia this year because I think that Nauta had more catches, more yards than a lot of people realize.
So I do think Warner's going to have a big year, but I wonder if he's going to have as big a year as Nauta did or as fans expect, just because Georgia's, in my opinion, the biggest concern, question mark, position group is tight end. Charlie Warner is the only tight end on Georgia's roster that has caught a pass in a Georgia uniform. He's the only tight end, period, if you want to even include Eli Wolf in there, that has more than 10 career receptions. And I do sort of wonder if, because he's very important as a blocker, and we've seen that he can do that. It's going to be a little bit different of an offense this year. And James Coley's offense significantly highlighted tight ends more so than Jim Chaney's offense did. All that being said, until we get a better idea of sort of the depth around that tight end position, I cautiously pump the brakes a little bit on saying Warner's going to have as productive a year as Nauta. And Nauta was just a really gifted wide receiver tight end. He's going to be a top 100 NFL draft pick. Even though he's not quite as big as Warner is, it's largely because he was such a great wide receiver and so good at route running and getting open and making contested catches.
Yeah, let me be clear about this. I'm not sure that Warner's going to be as effective as Nauta was a year ago, but if for somehow that doesn't happen, that could be one of the sneaky storylines of Georgia trying to be the best it can be offensively. That Nauta production a year ago was not insignificant. To change the subject here a little bit, Amos Williams mentions Clemson's defense not going to be anywhere near the level that it was in 2018. They lost way too many great players in that defensive line and at linebacker. Boy, they really did. They got lucky in 2018 to have a lot of guys come back that could have gone to the NFL. Now those guys are departed, but that's still a pretty talented group. And you're still talking about Xavier Thomas and guys like that. That's still going to be a pretty effective group up front.
Canaan Blues asked a question I really like. BA, do you think this will be the best team Georgia has had in the last decade? And do you think this is the best teams that Clemson and Bama have also had in the past decade?
So I'm going to go with Amos on this. I can't imagine that the Clemson team this year is more talented than it was a year ago.
Correct.
I mean, it remains to be seen what Trevor Lawrence emerges as, but I mean, can't you make a case that last year's Clemson team was more talented than the 2016 team, even though Deshaun Watson's an all-time great quarterback?
I would say yeah, probably.
I mean, Higgins and Justin Ross.
I mean, that 2016 Clemson team had Mike Williams, who was a monster.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end, they were a little bit better on the offensive line this year than they were in 2016. I would say probably last year's Clemson team was the best iteration of Clemson we'll see this decade. I think that the two most talented, in terms of just pure talent, teams in Alabama the past decade, so basically from 2010 on, neither of them won the national title. That 2010 team where Julio was a junior, Mark Ingram year after his Heisman Trophy season, Trent Richardson, just a ton of guys, a loaded team. That team lost 3 games. And then the 2015 team, or the team that lost to Clemson in the 2016 national title game, I mean, that defense was loaded.
We have some Alabama fans that watch the show from time to time. G. Grace on YouTube, maybe he'll chime in on this. You know, Alabama fans could say better than me what the most talented team is, but when you look at the way in which the talent spread out for Alabama this season, assuming that Najee Harris's head's still screwed on straight and, you know, others, I can't imagine you've ever had quite this good a disbursement of talent for Alabama. Now, I guess there's a lot of defensive linemen that you got to think about replacing, and I guess that's going to be a little bit of an issue. And, you know, offensive line kind of the same way. But, boy, you know, you've got top-end quarterback, top-end running back, top-end wide receivers. I'd hold
off on saying Najee Harris is a top-end running back.
Really? Because when I see him play, I see a guy that looks pretty impressive. I mean, I still have nightmares about him from the 2017 National Championship game.
He was also the 3rd best running back on Alabama's team last year.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily a fault of his.
I want to see him on a wider production scale. You know, I'd like to see him rush for 1,000 yards first before. Would you take Najee Harris over DeAndre Swift?
No. I'm very happy with DeAndre Swift. G. Grace, by the way, who is an Alabama fan, also mentions that Brian Robinson, who was – this is an example of how well Alabama has recruited. Like I said, I don't love giving credit here, but you got to give credit. Robinson was like a top 100 player in the country. He was from Tuscaloosa, a running back, and he hasn't really sniffed the field at all. But it sounds like Grace thinks he may be able to hop in there and be a part of this year. But to get back to the original question about how Georgia factors in all this, so it may be as talented a team as Alabama's had. Clemson's going to be at least close, maybe slightly less talented than the 2018 team. Not only is this the most talented team that Georgia's had in a decade, I have a hard time believing that on paper Georgia's ever been collectively more talented than it's going to be in 2019. Now, we're in a day and age in which the exchange rate really favors the elite top-end teams in a way that it didn't probably used to years ago in college football. But on paper, this has to be the most talented Georgia team of all time. It just has to be.
So, I mean, we have, on paper, yes. From a recruiting standpoint, absolutely. That 2012 team had a very good Aaron Murray.
It did.
He was elite. Had Todd Gurley, who was not peak of his powers, Todd Gurley, yet, but still very, very good. And it also had Jarvis Jones, a difference maker. I don't know.
And don't forget about Alec Ogletree, who
was a monster in that Alabama game.
Alec Ogletree was insane. I guess I'd want to see offensive line comparisons. The 2012 offensive line at this point in time is hard for me to even remember all 5 guys.
I think the 2019 team right now is maybe number 2. If there's a defensive difference maker who is in the same atmosphere as a Jarvis Jones, well, they don't have to be exactly like Jarvis Jones was, who was probably the best defender in college football that year. But they have to at least have a guy like that who can get after the passer and make just life miserable for Tua Tagovailoa and Trevor Lawrence when they meet.
I do not want to stir up trouble here, but I have to admit that when I rank my own personal, top Georgia teams of all time, I actually don't rank the 2012 team probably as high as some other people would, because this is still a team that lost 38-7 at South Carolina. And I'm not trying to pick on them or, disparage or whatever else. I'm certainly not trying to stir up trouble. But this 2019 team is not going to lose 38-7 to anybody.
Yeah, and I mean the thing with the 2012 team too is they got absolutely punked by South Carolina. I think it was 35-6 was the final.
That's
score.
What I was talking about. Yeah, 35-6, 38-7, whatever it was.
I don't think that's going to happen.
I don't think. I think this team is incapable of losing a game like that. But in fairness, really talented 2018 teams and really talented 2017 teams for Georgia also had non-competitive games on the road at Auburn, at LSU. What goes back to what we spent a good bit of the time of the show talking about yesterday is that's one of the things for Georgia to demonstrate this season, that it has grown in that regard, that it's not going to have the just disappearing Saturday, that it just disappears off the face of the earth for a Saturday. This 2019 team's got to prove that. I mean, I hate to say this about the 2012 team, but I will just admit my own feelings on this. Going into that SEC championship game, I was shocked that Georgia played as well as it did. I just didn't give Georgia much of a chance to win that day because I felt like there was a mental quotient just kind of missing from that team, because the signature win for that 2012 team was against Florida. If you go back and watch that game, as much as I love beating up on
that game. It was ugly.
Yeah, as much as I love beating up on the Gators, that was not a stellar performance by Georgia, even though Florida came into the game ranked in the top 10. That was not a stellar performance from Georgia that day. So the 2012 team, as talented as it was, man, they had a lot of Saturdays where it didn't seem to all add up together the way that it was supposed to.
Mm-hmm. But, I mean, arguably they've come the closest to beating Alabama and a championship Alabama team at that.
Yeah, that is certainly true. As far as, like, you know, who can be the Jermaine Jones, a lot of really good questions about that. Nolan Smith, Jermaine Johnson. I mean, one of those guys. Somebody mentioned Adam Anderson before. One of those guys stepping up as a real, legit, intense pass rusher. The way that Jones was for Georgia in 2012. I mean, that is going to be one of the key stories.
Right. I mean, you know, I'm getting roasted in the YouTube comment section here, but do you know who Georgia's leading sack or pass, or who led the team in sacks that's coming back this year? And do you know how many they had?
I can't say that I do.
It's Channing Tindall. He had 2.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's a big challenge. You got to find a way to do that. The number I always kind of go with is that 40 number. I would love to see Georgia get up to that 40-sack number. Now, we've seen Alabama teams within the last half decade go north of 50 twice. I don't think Georgia necessarily needs 50, but they got to try to find a way to get 40 somehow. I think that could be a real key number for sure.
Clemson, Alabama, and Ohio State all had over 40 sacks last year.
Yeah, I mean, I just think as much as I'm a believer that kind of a 900-yard receiving number for an individual is a key number, I think that 40-sack number is kind of a key number as well. I do.
And part of that, too, to get to that number, I think Kirby may have to change the way he runs his defense, you know, because I think especially this last year, they were very much all right, we'll let you, you know, sort of move the ball, get to around the 40-yard line, and then from there, we're not going to let you, you know, beat us over the top or do anything like that. And I do think maybe they do need to take a little bit more risks in terms of trying to get after the pass rush and create negative plays.
So my feeling on that's a little bit different. And I want to be clear about this. When I say I want to see Georgia get to 40 sacks, I don't necessarily want to see a game plan design try to get more sacks. I just want to see elite top-end athletes like Nolan Smith and Jermaine Johnson and Brenton Cox and Adam Anderson. I just want to see them beat their man individually. And even if Georgia wants to run kind of a more of a save, keep the ball in front of you type defense, you've got one-on-one battles being one that still lead to sacks. My assumption is, I'm no former coach, my assumption is that's a lot of how Alabama has generated sacks. Certainly Quinnen Williams got a lot of sacks by winning one-on-one battles on the inside for Alabama, the defensive line this year. That's where I want to see the Georgia sacks come from, not creative blitzes or creative, you know, pass pressures are being called, but just simple man-on-man, too much speed, too much power, too much athleticism. That's kind of where I want to see those Georgia sacks coming from this year.
That's certainly a fair point. And that, you know, Georgia doesn't need to go blitz happy like they were under Todd Grantham, because I know that left a lot of people frustrated, and thus coining of the term third and Grantham.
By the way, Amos Williams and others pointing out a good point that the South Carolina team that beat Georgia was a really good team.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. Still, you hated seeing a Georgia team that talented, not competitive, not in the game in a situation like that. It's part of the, you know, the mental hurdle, as to go back to what we talked about at the start of the show. I don't think rests with these Georgia coaches and players as much as it rests with a lot of Georgia fans who've lived through these close but no cigar moments, and it's the restlessness that comes from that. It's a little bit of anguish that comes from that, and yeah, when you get into these discussions, it's hard not to think about what could have almost been in 2012 if not for this and that, or what could have almost been in even a year like 2014 or, some other years like that where you could have, gotten really close there at the end of the Richt era. And a lot of that's what Georgia's playing to kind of fully and finally exercise those demons in 2019. All right. We're going to get ready to go. Here's a part of our R.S. Andrews cool down. Really appreciate you being a part of the program. Don't forget to check out R.S. Andrews at rsandrews.com. They do a lot of different things, heating and air, plumbing, electrical. This time of year, though, especially when it kind of peaks up to that 60-degree temperatures like it is today, like it was yesterday, you start thinking about this upcoming warm weather season. You want to make sure your air conditioning is running right. R.S. Andrews can certainly make sure that's the case for you. They'll give you that R.S. Andrews tune-up. Their trained techs will show up on time. They'll be well-dressed, ready to go, and they'll be ready to give your house that thorough look over that it needs to make sure you're ready for the upcoming season no matter what it is. Furnace is going to make it through the winter. Air conditioning, be able to do what it needs to do this spring and summer, or plumbing and electrical stuff. R.S. Andrews covers it all for you, and that's why we recommend them here at DawgNation. So check them out at rsandrews.com, and we know that you'll be glad you did. All right, we'll be back tomorrow, 10 a.m., as for DawgNation Daily, just like always. And then when the program's done, back here for the R.S. Andrews cool down as well. Looking forward to having you as a part of that. Of course, before the hedges tomorrow afternoon at 3. We'll be back on video a little later on today with a DN90 with a little more look at what's happening around UGA. Hope you all have a great day, and we'll look forward to speaking to you tomorrow.